You might think the absolute worst year in human history involved massive global world wars or modern nuclear fallout. But you must turn the clock back to the year 1347 to witness a true, horrifying global purging. It was not merely a difficult era. It was a decade where the living were simply not numerous enough to bury the dead, defined entirely by blood, pus, and absolute continental despair. We are going to explore the darkest chapter of human civilization. I have specifically designed the roadmap of this journey so that every single event we uncover becomes exponentially more terrifying and incomprehensible than the one before it, ensuring the latter stages of our path are heavily favored over the former in sheer horror. Before we dive into this apocalyptic nightmare, please take one quick second to subscribe and register to the channel. Your continued support allows us to keep bringing these incredible historical mysteries to light. Now let us return to the dawn of the Great Mortality. Without a single bomb dropped or a single bullet fired, a completely invisible enemy managed to cross the world and wipe out up to 60% of the entire European population. Entire thriving, wealthy cities were quickly reduced to silent, rotting graveyards in a matter of weeks. What exact series of events triggered this unprecedented biological catastrophe? And how did a silent microscopic organism manage to completely destroy the ancient feudal order of the world? Are you genuinely ready to witness the true awakening of the Black Death? Let us begin our descent into this nightmare at the impenetrable walled city of Kaffa, located on the edge of the Crimean Peninsula. Before we witness the horrific violence that broke these walls, please take a brief moment to subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing these dark historical truths to light. The year is 1346. The wealthy trading hub of Kaffa is under a massive, suffocating siege by the fearsome Mongol army of the Golden Horde. The city walls are incredibly thick, and the defenders are fully prepared for a long, brutal war of attrition. But something deeply terrifying begins happening in the Mongol encampment outside the gates. The fierce warriors are not falling to enemy arrows or swords. Instead, they are suddenly dropping dead by the thousands in a state of absolute agony. Their bodies are convulsing violently. Foul-smelling pus is oozing from massive swelling glands, and their flesh is turning a sickly, rotting black. Absolute panic begins to spread as the invisible killer moves rapidly through the dark tents. Faced with total annihilation from a disease they simply cannot fight, the Mongol commander makes a truly horrific and unprecedented tactical decision. Rather than sounding a full retreat in total defeat, the Golden Horde decides to share their gruesome fate with their enemies. They drag the heavily infected, bloated corpses of their fallen brothers to the massive wooden catapults and trebuchets lining the chaotic battlefield. The brutal order is given. The massive siege mechanisms groan loudly under the unnatural weight, and instead of launching heavy boulders, they hurl the diseased, rotting bodies high into the air. The dead corpses fly directly over the towering stone walls and explode upon brutal impact on the crowded, narrow streets of Kaffa. Blood, infected tissue, and decaying flesh are violently scattered across the terrified civilian population. The suffocating smell of death instantly blankets the enclosed city. In the blink of an eye, a traditional medieval military siege is completely transformed into the very first devastating act of biological warfare in recorded human history. The deadly trap has officially snapped shut upon the panicked citizens. This specific historical event is profoundly impressive because of the sheer, ruthless ingenuity required to weaponize a rapidly dying army. The Mongols completely bypassed the impenetrable physical defenses of the city by raining a microscopic apocalypse straight down upon their heads. Yet, what makes this horrific military tactic so incredibly strange and historically baffling is the absolute lack of scientific knowledge during this dark era. The Mongol army possessed absolutely no concept of germ theory, bacteria, or microscopic pathogens. They had no scientific understanding of exactly how the disease spread from person to person. But through pure, brutal survival instinct, they flawlessly understood the fundamental mechanics of contagion. They intuitively knew that the rotting flesh of their dead held an invisible, conquering power far greater than any steel sword or burning arrow. If that was not surprising enough, the terrifying bombardment of Kaffa was merely the brutal delivery mechanism for the disease. The violent trap in the city was sprung with explosive force, but this apocalyptic pathogen did not just magically appear outside those high stone walls. Where exactly did this invisible, world-ending demon silently originate, and how did it quietly mutate in the absolute darkest, quietest corners of the earth before ever reaching the bloody battlefield? We witness the violent trap spring shut at Kaffa, but this apocalyptic pathogen originated far away from the bloody battlefield. Press number 1 in the comments right now if you believe the absolute deadliest threats always begin in total silence. We must leave the enclosed stone walls of Crimea and travel deep into the remote, wind-swept steppes of Central Asia. Specifically, we are looking at the ancient, isolated trading settlements nestled around Lake Issyk-Kul in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. While the devastating siege of Kaffa exploded in 1346, archaeologists excavating these quiet, sprawling lands discovered a deeply chilling, hidden timeline. Beneath the freezing soil, they unearthed a clustered series of ancient gravestones dated precisely to the years 1338 and 1339. The faded, cryptic inscriptions on these stones plainly stated that the victims had died of a mysterious, unnamed pestilence. Modern genetic analysis of the dental pulp recovered from these exact graves perfectly matched the DNA of Yersinia pestis, the very bacteria responsible for the Black Death. Long before it was violently weaponized by the Mongol army, this microscopic demon was born in the deep shadows. It silently mutated and established a parasitic foothold within the bloodstreams of local wild rodent populations, specifically marmots, heavily concentrated in the high, unforgiving mountain passes. The true horror of its biological design lay in a single, microscopic mutation. The bacteria violently multiplied inside the stomach of a flea, completely blocking its digestive tract. The starving, frantic flea would then bite its host with extreme aggression, directly regurgitating the lethal bacteria into the open bloodstream. This specific origin point is profoundly impressive because it highlights the extreme, terrifying contrast of the impending disaster. The violent siege of Kaffa was incredibly loud, chaotic, and heavily documented by panicked survivors. But the actual biological doomsday for humanity was quietly born in the absolute middle of nowhere. A microscopic, single-celled organism slowly and methodically perfected its highly lethal genetic code in the freezing wilderness, preparing to systematically wipe out half the known world without ever making a single sound. Yet, what remains so historically strange and deeply chilling is the absolute, flawless stealth of its slow global migration. Scientists still marvel at how this pathogen managed to travel thousands of miles across the vast, heavily traversed Silk Road over the span of nearly a decade without triggering a massive, premature alarm. It acted as an incredibly patient, invisible hitchhiker. It quietly embedded itself in the raw silk, warm animal furs, and heavy grain sacks carried by unsuspecting, weary merchant caravans. It moved methodically from isolated trading post to bustling trading post, quietly infiltrating the complex, ancient arteries of global commerce. It patiently waited in the dark until it reached the highly populated, densely packed urban centers where it could finally unleash its true, explosive potential. If that was not surprising enough, this invisible hitchhiker was now fully awakened and ready to consume absolutely everything in its path. The silent spark was lit in the Asian steppes, and the plague was violently unleashed at the walls of Kaffa. But what unimaginable, apocalyptic horror occurred when the desperate, infected survivors of that siege finally fled across the sea and brought the disease directly to the completely unprepared shores of Europe? The silent spark was lit in the steppes, and the plague was violently unleashed at Kaffa, but the true global nightmare began when the infected survivors desperately fled across the sea. Press number 3 in the comments right now if you believe you could maintain your sanity during a completely unstoppable global pandemic. We must now anchor our focus on the bustling Mediterranean trading port of Messina, located on the island of Sicily in southern Italy. The exact date is October of 1347. The autumn winds brought 12 Genoese trading galleys slowly into the busy harbor. These specific merchant ships had barely escaped the horrific biological bombardment at the siege of Kaffa. They were seeking safe refuge from the horrors of Crimea, but they unknowingly brought an apocalyptic curse directly to the heart of Europe. When the local Sicilian authorities finally rowed out and cautiously boarded the eerily silent vessels, a scene of unimaginable horror slapped them directly across the face. The heavy wooden decks were dangerously slick with rotting blood and human waste. The vast majority of the hardened sailors were already dead, their corpses frozen in grotesquely twisted postures of unimaginable physical pain. The few surviving crewmen were barely clinging to life. They were heavily delirious, violently coughing up thick blood, and their bodies were entirely covered in massive, black, oozing boils known as buboes. Foul-smelling pus seeped continuously from these agonizing, egg-sized swellings aggressively ballooning on their groins, necks, and armpits. This singular arrival is profoundly terrifying because it perfectly demonstrates the absolute, unstoppable velocity of the Black Death. The plague did not slowly crawl across the Italian countryside. It exploded with the unnatural, consuming speed of a raging forest fire caught in a violent windstorm. Within mere days of those 12 ghost ships dropping their heavy iron anchors, the lethal bacteria jumped from the infected sailors and the starving black rats hidden deep in the cargo holds directly into the densely packed, completely unprepared civilian population of Messina. The devastation was so absolute and instantaneous that healthy citizens began dropping dead in the cobblestone streets while frantically trying to flee the doomed city. It was an apocalyptic blitzkrieg that completely overwhelmed the local infrastructure before anyone even realized what they were actually fighting. The living were rapidly overwhelmed by the staggering volume of the unburied dead. Yet, what makes the catastrophic arrival at Messina so deeply strange and historically terrifying is the complete failure of all contemporary human logic and heavily fortified borders. Medieval doctors were completely paralyzed by an enemy they could not physically see. They genuinely believed the mass death was caused by miasma, which they described as corrupted, bad air blown in by the winds, or an unfortunate, deadly alignment of the planets. Because they fundamentally misunderstood the microscopic nature of bacteria, every single medical defense they attempted actively made the horrifying situation much worse. The massive stone city walls and heavy iron gates of Europe, built meticulously over centuries to successfully repel invading armies, were utterly useless. The gates of hell had been kicked entirely open by just 12 rotting wooden ships, and absolutely nothing humanity had built could close them. If that was not surprising enough, the blinding panic in Messina practically guaranteed the rapid destruction of the rest of the continent. Terrified residents fled the doomed port, unknowingly carrying the lethal bacteria deep into the wealthy heart of Italy. But with absolutely no medicine and no hope of a medical cure, how did the desperate, highly organized authorities of Venice attempt to fight back against an unstoppable ghost? The gates of hell were kicked entirely open in Messina, and the terrifying plague rapidly spread north across the Italian countryside. Before we examine the desperate, cold-blooded measures enacted by the remaining cities, please take a brief moment to subscribe to the channel so we can continue uncovering the darkest secrets of human history together. Now we must shift our focus toward the freezing coastal waters outside the incredibly powerful maritime Republic of Venice. By the time the horrifying rumors of the Black Death reached the ruling council of the Grand City, the invisible enemy was already relentlessly marching across the mainland. Realizing that all contemporary medicine was completely useless, the desperate Venetian authorities decided to abandon traditional science and rely entirely on absolute, ruthless isolation. They enacted a strictly enforced, completely cold-blooded maritime law. Any single merchant vessel arriving from a suspected plague-infected port was violently repelled from the Grand Canals by heavily armed guards. These weary, desperate ships were forced under the strict threat of immediate military destruction to drop their heavy iron anchors far out in the isolated, freezing waters of the Adriatic Sea. They were legally ordered to remain completely stranded there for exactly 40 days, a specific time duration known in the local Italian dialect as 40 giorni. Absolutely no one was allowed to step onto the solid land, and absolutely no rescue boats were allowed to approach them. This brutally extreme measure is profoundly impressive because of the sheer, terrifyingly cold calculation required to actively enforce it. The ruling council of Venice fully understood they were effectively issuing a collective, agonizing death sentence to countless innocent sailors. If the invisible plague was secretly hiding on board just one of those anchored ships, the completely healthy crew members were hopelessly trapped in a confined, floating wooden box with the heavily infected. The government purposefully abandoned their own citizens and vital trading partners to a miserable, lonely fade-out in the dark ocean. They listened to the distant screams echoing over the water, betting entirely that ruthlessly sacrificing the few would miraculously save the massive population on the mainland. Yet, what makes this specific historical event so incredibly strange and profoundly impactful is the accidental, deeply ironic legacy it ultimately left behind. The Venetian authorities possessed absolutely no scientific understanding of microscopic bacteria, modern viral transmission cycles, or correct biological incubation periods. Their strict decision to enforce exactly 40 days of total isolation was driven purely by ancient religious symbolism, echoing the biblical 40 days of the Great Flood, combined with utter governmental desperation rather than genuine medical knowledge. However, through complete, unintended historical coincidence, this brutal act of maritime abandonment birthed one of the most vital, foundational concepts in modern global medical history. The ancient Venetian phrase quaranta giorni slowly evolved into the universally recognized modern word quarantine, a massive, life-saving medical protocol utilized aggressively across the entire modern world today was accidentally constructed directly from the absolute helplessness, raw physical fear, and profound loneliness of the 14th century. If that was not surprising enough, this brutal system of quarantine could only temporarily delay the absolute inevitable doom. The lethal bacteria eventually slipped through the heavily fortified blockades and absolutely devastated the Venetian population just like the rest of the continent. The great mortality seemed entirely unstoppable, leaving millions of rotting corpses in its wake. But when the horrific dust finally settled over Europe, what deeply bizarre and totally illogical societal transformation arose directly from the ashes of the old world? How did this apocalyptic mass death accidentally shatter the ancient, unbreakable chains of the global feudal system forever? We left the freezing waters of Venice, where quarantine delayed the inevitable, but the terrifying plague ultimately shattered the ancient chains of the global feudal system. Press number 5 in the comments right now if you believe that sometimes a society must completely collapse before it can truly improve. As the initial brutal wave of the Black Death finally began to slowly recede by the year 1351, the surviving population emerged from their locked homes to find a world completely unrecognizable. Between 30 and 60% of the entire European population had been violently wiped from the face of the earth in just a few short years. Thriving, densely populated cities were transformed into silent, rotting ghost towns. The sprawling agricultural estates of the noble class were completely overgrown with wild weeds, and the once deafening noise of bustling medieval markets was replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. But the most staggering transformation was not the massive physical death toll itself. The true shock was the catastrophic, total collapse of the ancient feudal economic system. For centuries, wealthy aristocratic lords held absolute, iron-fisted control over the peasant class. Serfs were essentially slaves bound permanently to the land, forced to work endless hours for absolutely zero wages and living in constant, crushing poverty. Countless bloody, violent peasant rebellions had attempted to break this cruel system over the centuries, and every single one had failed miserably. Yet, in a deeply ironic twist of fate, a microscopic, mindless bacterium accomplished in 4 years what massive human uprisings could not achieve in 400 years. Because the plague indiscriminately slaughtered millions of working-class citizens, it accidentally created the most severe labor shortage in recorded human history. There were simply no longer enough living peasants to harvest the massive golden wheat fields or shear the countless sheep. The wealthy, powerful lords were suddenly left entirely paralyzed, staring helplessly at their rotting crops and rapidly dying livestock. The surviving peasants suddenly realized they possessed immense, unprecedented leverage. For the very first time in recorded history, the poorest people in society could boldly look the wealthiest nobles in the eye and strictly demand incredibly high wages, lower taxes, and the fundamental right to own their own land. If a lord refused to pay, the peasant simply walked away to a neighboring estate that would gladly meet their steep demands. The rigid, oppressive social pyramid of the medieval world completely inverted almost overnight. A massive, previously unimaginable wealth transfer occurred rapidly across the continent. Surviving lower-class citizens suddenly found themselves inheriting vast properties from completely wiped-out families. They began wearing expensive, high-quality silk clothing and eating rich, heavy meats that were once strictly reserved for royalty. Governments desperately tried to pass emergency laws attempting to force wages back down and legally bind the peasants back into servitude. But the absolute biological reality of the empty world made these frantic laws completely useless. The brutal, unforgiving era of serfdom was permanently severed. If that was not surprising enough, this microscopic killer essentially functioned as a horrific, impartial equalizer for humanity. It mercilessly slaughtered half the known world, but by doing so, it directly forced the surviving civilization to undergo a radical, incredibly wealthy rebirth. Millions of innocent people died agonizing deaths, but their tragic sacrifice accidentally birthed the modern economic middle class. But when an apocalyptic catastrophe inadvertently frees the survivors and paves the way for the brilliant Renaissance, what ultimate, lingering lesson does the Black Death teach us about the terrifying, bloody price of human evolution? As we stand among the silent, overgrown ruins of the 14th century, we are forced to confront a deeply unsettling reality about human progress. We have traced this apocalyptic nightmare from the brutal biological warfare at the stone walls of Kaffa back to the silent, freezing steppes of Kyrgyzstan. We witnessed the unstoppable horror of the ghost ships arriving in Messina, and we felt the cold, calculating isolation of the very first quarantines in Venice. Every single step of this dark journey proved that the greatest threats to our civilization do not always come from massive invading armies or huge celestial events. Sometimes, the end of the world is entirely microscopic. Before we reflect on the ultimate philosophical truth of this bloody rebirth, please take a quick moment to subscribe to the channel so we can continue uncovering the most profound mysteries of our past together. The true legacy of the Black Death is not merely a staggering death toll or an entire continent reduced to rotting graveyards. It is a terrifying monument to the unpredictable nature of human evolution. We desperately want to believe that societal progress is a peaceful, upward climb achieved through logic, enlightened philosophy, and deliberate moral choices. But the great mortality proves a much darker reality. Sometimes, the heavy, unbreakable chains of a deeply unjust society can only be dissolved by a catastrophic, completely impartial force of nature. It took the agonizing deaths of tens of millions of innocent people to finally break the back of the brutal feudal system, inadvertently paving the way for the wealth, freedom, and artistic explosion of the Renaissance. The absolute worst year in human history essentially forced humanity to reinvent itself from the ashes of grief. As we look around at the massive, heavily entrenched political and economic structures defining our modern world today, we are left with one profoundly terrifying question. What specific, seemingly permanent pillars of our modern civilization are secretly rotting from the inside out? And exactly what invisible, apocalyptic force is quietly waiting in the dark right now to force our next violent global reset?